There are neighborhoods that sell themselves with glossy brochures and manicured photos. Hedges clipped into identical curves, mailboxes painted the exact same shade, driveways that could double as art galleries. Oak Ridge Estates had that polished look in pamphlets and in the lips of newcomers who wanted everything tidy and predictable. Underneath the uniform shutters and the council-approved flower beds, however, life was still happening in all of its tender, inconvenient messiness. Children learned to ride bikes on cracked sidewalks patched with chewing gum optimism. Neighbors grew tired with age and medical bills. Someone always kept a box of donated canned soup on a stoop for whoever needed it next. Those human stories made the street breathe. They also made the place imperfect, and perfection was, in the eyes of the Homeowners Association, negotiable. The association had rules. They had committees. They had an annual calendar of petty triumphs and tiny tyrannies upheld by meeting minutes, and a clipboard that seemed to wield more power than any single voice should. The board took its role seriously, too seriously for some, sermon-like when it came to curb appeal and the neighborhood's projection of affluence. Meetings were short on empathy and long on enforcement. There was a small but steady hum of resentment under the polite clapping at every gathering, the kind that began with a "this is our home" posture and ended with a stack of courtesy letters mailed in institutional INK. The center of the coming storm sat an old truck. It was not the kind of vehicle that turned heads for its chrome or its sheen. The yellow paint had faded to something closer to the color of old bread. The driver's side mirror had been replaced with a convex one salvaged from a thrift store. There were dents that told stories of low-speed wars with mailboxes and narrow garage entries. A bumper sticker from a decade ago proclaimed allegiance to a radio station that no longer existed. When the sun hit the hood just so, it reflected a history rather than light. Patches of rust like metals of stubborn utility. For most residents, the truck was an oddity at best. When they talked about it, their voices softened into the indulgent tones people use for familiar eccentricities. For the board, it was a symbol to be corrected. Curb appeal was a phrase invoked like scripture. The truck violated their tidy narrative. It was parked, as it always had been, on the gravel beside the house of Eduardo Jimenez. Eduardo's house was a modest ranch on the corner, with 2 cracked steps and a porch light that flickered when it rained. He kept his garden small, vegetables more than ornamentals, because he grew things to eat and to give. There was a weathered rocking chair where he would sit in the late afternoons tracing the day with the slow, careful movements of a man who lived simply and with purpose. He had a handsomely lined face that bore the evidence of decades of work. Calloused fingers, a gentle stoop that had learned to carry weight without complaint. The truck was part of him. Some neighbors called it the old yellow hauler, with a fondness that, for a while, was enough. Eduardo had a quiet life that was full of obligations others rarely saw. There was a mother who lived alone a few streets down who depended on the weekly pickup from Eduardo's truck. Groceries, blankets in winter, the occasional heater when the old furnace failed. There were bouquets of flowers delivered after funerals and the quiet transport of furniture for families moving on when a landlord raised the rent. He hauled mattresses for the shelter on second Saturdays and boxes of children's clothes folded with the tenderness of a volunteer who knew that newness could be a small mercy. The truck was not a vanity vessel. It was an instrument for making things easier for people who had no other help. Among the homeowners, there were those who saw and those who preferred not to see. Children, whose attention is kindly by default, greeted him with honesty. They ran up when they saw the truck and climbed into its cab to pretend they were on a mission. Sometimes they sat in the bed and held a volunteer's guide or a bag of donated canned food like treasure. The elderly, who count how many times the same 4 seasons arrive, nodded with gratitude as he drove by. There were faces who offered quiet blessings, cronies of grief and resilience who understood that Eduardo's truck meant more than its battered exterior. But the association's rhetoric did not account for the soft measures of worth a person accrues over time. It accounted only for the visible. A complaint landed one Tuesday morning in the format the HOA favored, typed, impersonal, stamped with the rule number that declared the preservation of community aesthetic standards as paramount. A neighbor had filed it, and signed but steady in its intent. The truck was an eyesore. The truck was lowering property values. The letter asked, politely but firmly, for the vehicle to be concealed from public view or relocated within 14 days. When the board met to discuss the letter, the tone of the room hardened. There was a scene rehearsed with an anxious relish for order. The president of the HOA, a woman whose name the minutes always capitalized with an air of gravity, read the complaint aloud without mentioning the acts of kindness the truck represented. Others echoed small grievances. The truck's silhouette at dusk, the way its shadow dented the immaculate picture frame they kept up in their minds when visitors came over for wine and small talk. A few board members smiled at the thought of a tidy neighborhood, and in that smile there was the comfort of belonging to the right side of an unspoken social contract. Word of the complaint drifted through the cul-de-sac like the first cold edge of winter. It traveled faster than any official correspondence. Some neighbors were disturbed by the letter. Others were alarmed that rules could be wielded so quickly and felt no sympathy for a man who, in their view, chose to live outside the social polish they encouraged. Family dynamics shifted in doorways. Assumptions drew tight lines. He must be irresponsible, they said quietly. He must not care. In the space between rumor and reality, a narrative was building. It was hungry for simplicity. Eduardo, as was his way, did not make proclamations. He read the letter and let it fold into the pocket of his jacket. He looked at the old truck as one might regard a faithful companion, not pristine, but necessary. His hands, which had a habit of remembering work even when his head was tired, rested on the steering wheel like an oath. He kept his routine, picking up donations, ferrying blankets to the shelter, and stopping at the corner store for 3 loaves of day-old bread the baker set aside, because the neighborhood kids liked the crusts. There were no grand gestures. There was simply the steady cadence of a man continuing to do what he did best. Not everyone remained neutral. A neighbor with a newer SUV parked perfectly within the lines and a hedge trimmed to the golden ratio of suburban contentment decided that enforcement was an opportunity to assert the rightness of his own choices. He called the board to ask if the rule would be applied uniformly. Another member, who had once been a teacher and had learned young the cost of compassion, began to wonder whether the rulebook had teeth or a heart. The board sent a follow-up notice, a final reminder that compliance was expected. If the truck were not concealed or moved, fines would begin to accrue. The finality in the phrasing landed like a small stone thrown into still water. The ripples touched porches and people who had never believed they would be touched by a homeowner's arbitration board. The truck sat in the late afternoon light, as if waiting for a verdict that had nothing to do with its mechanical health. Children still climbed into its bed to play pirate or mailman. The old wooden crates in the back were stacked and filled with donated coats waiting for winter. The neighborhood's human ledger was more complicated than the association's ledger. One line could not account for the other. On the evening the notice's deadline edged closer, a meeting was scheduled. The association wanted to vote on enforcement. Some wanted the truck gone. Others wanted the rule applied less like a hammer and more like a hand. Underneath the glossy veneer of Oak Ridge, people were choosing sides without saying the words aloud. For Eduardo, the future of his truck was not about pride. It was about whether the quiet services that had become his life could continue without the constant threat of penalty. He had no intention of fleeing from the place he had helped make livable. Outside, the sun slipped behind the rooftops, and the truck's old headlights caught the last pale light like 2 eyes that had seen too much to be bothered by appearances. Inside the homes around the cul-de-sac, lights came on, and people prepared for a meeting that carried the weight of something small and large all at once. The final notice had done what notices often do. It demanded a response and forced the community to reckon with what it valued most: appearance or the human stories that lived beneath it. The vote would be held the next evening. The board's gavel awaited, but it would soon have to strike not just the rulebook but the conscience of a neighborhood that, until now, had let convenience and image sit in the same chair. The truck remained quietly parked, its engine cooling. There were prayers in some houses, sighs in others, and a deep settling of expectation in all. The story, which had begun with a simple letter, was about to test who Oak Ridge chose to be. The evening of the HOA vote arrived with the quiet heaviness of a storm that hadn't yet broken. The air in Oak Ridge Estates felt unusually still, as if the trees themselves were listening. Porch lights flickered on one by one, casting faint golden halos across manicured lawns, but even the glow seemed muted by uncertainty. Everyone knew the meeting would not be routine. It would not be quick. And for the first time in a long while, it would not be about shrubs, roses, or the color of a mailbox. It would be about a man, his battered truck, and the values the community claimed to hold. Inside the clubhouse, chairs had been arranged in neat rows, the kind of orderly formation the HOA favored, a visual reminder that the board intended to maintain control. Attendance was higher than usual. Neighbors who typically avoided HOA meetings out of boredom or frustration trickled in with restless expressions. They came not for procedure, but for clarity, perhaps even redemption. The board sat at the front, framed behind a long folding table draped with a cloth bearing the HOA emblem. Behind their clipped posture was a subtle tension. They were accustomed to enforcing rules, not defending their spirit. Their faces reflected a certain defensive pride, as if they were preparing themselves to deliver an unpleasant but necessary truth. As residents settled into chairs, whispered conversations began circling like cautious birds. Some spoke of property values, convinced the old truck tarnished the neighborhood's curated aesthetic. Others murmured about Eduardo, his quiet kindness, the favors he had done without asking for anything in return. Parents pointed out how he always slowed down when kids played near the road. Elderly neighbors remembered the day he cleared their gutters without being asked. These small testimonies lingered like warm currents under the cold structure of the meeting. Eduardo arrived without ceremony. He took the last empty seat in the back row, his posture careful, his eyes lowered. There was no air of confrontation about him. He carried the same gentle quiet he always had, as though he believed the gathering was simply another civic ritual, not a judgment of the life he lived. In truth, he had slept poorly the night before, worrying not about his reputation, but about the work the truck allowed him to do, the errands he would no longer be able to complete if the board made their decision final. When the meeting finally began, the board president cleared her throat with authority. Her voice, precise and unwavering, recited the agenda: a review of the complaint, a restatement of the rule concerning the storage of unsightly vehicles, and a vote on whether to proceed with fines. Her tone carried the firm edge of someone who believed in order above nuance. For her, rules existed to be upheld, not to be questioned. She presented photographs taken from the street, the truck's peeling paint, its dents, its visible wear. Each image was displayed on a screen like evidence in a quiet trial. There was no mention of the blankets the truck had delivered, the furniture it had carried, the groceries it transported for people who had no one else to rely on. The photos were cold, sterile, factual. The room felt divided. Some nodded approvingly. Others looked uncomfortable, shifting in their chairs, as if the details of the truck's state were less important than the story everyone instinctively sensed was missing. The board opened the floor for comments. A few residents stood, speaking with rehearsed confidence about neighborhood standards and property values. Their words were polite but sharp, woven with the unspoken fear that imperfection could spread like weeds. They insisted the enforcement wasn't personal. It was about protecting the community's investment. Then, slowly, other voices emerged. A mother spoke of the night her car broke down and Eduardo arrived within minutes to lend her a ride home with groceries and her sleeping toddler. An elderly man shared how Eduardo's truck carried boxes of his late wife's belongings when he could not muster the strength to handle the task alone. A teenager raised his hand and explained how he and his friends helped unload coats for donation from the truck every winter. Each testimony shifted the room's temperature. What had begun as a sterile debate about appearances grew watermarked with real stories, each peeling back a layer of misunderstanding. Yet even as these truths emerged, the board maintained their rigid stance, insisting kindness did not exempt someone from compliance. When the president finally addressed Eduardo directly, all eyes turned to him. Her voice remained professional, but there was something clipped beneath it, something that suggested she had already decided how the evening would end. She asked him if he had anything to say before the vote. The room waited, breath held. Eduardo stood slowly, not out of defiance, but with the quiet dignity of someone accustomed to working without recognition. He didn't offer excuses. Instead, he gave a simple explanation. The truck was more than transportation. It was his livelihood, his service to others, and the last relic of a life he had built with his late father. A man whose values shaped everything he did. As he spoke, the details spilled out naturally. The trips to the donation center, the emergency drives to help a neighbor in need, the medical supply runs for his mother. His words were humble, factual, without embellishment. He did not ask for pity, nor did he challenge the rule. He simply explained what the truck allowed him to do. Silence followed, thick and contemplative. The board exchanged glances, uneasy ones. One by one, neighbors turned toward the board with expressions that had changed. Some with guilt, some with recognition, some with protective resolve. It was as though they had finally been handed the missing half of a story they thought they understood. But the board, ever devoted to precedence, continued with the vote. Hands raised. A few abstained. Several hesitated. But ultimately, a narrow majority voted to enforce the rule. Fines would begin in 7 days unless the truck was concealed or removed. The decision landed with a heaviness that made some gasp softly, others straighten in discomfort, and others lower their heads. Eduardo nodded once. Not in agreement, but in resignation. As neighbors dispersed, the clubhouse emptied slowly. Conversations hummed with conflict, some defensive, some ashamed, some furious. A few approached Eduardo, offering quiet support. Others walked past him, avoiding eye contact, unable to reconcile the rules with the humanity they had just witnessed. By the time the room was empty, the night had grown colder. Outside, the old truck sat where it always had, illuminated by the faint glow of a street lamp. It looked even older under the artificial light, more vulnerable, more symbolic, but the story was not finished. Something had shifted. Threads were pulling tight. And though the board believed the matter settled, the days ahead would unravel truths none of them were prepared for. The next morning, something extraordinary would occur, something that would make the HOA question every assumption they had made about that truck and about the man who drove it. Morning arrived quietly, with a mellow gold sunlight that painted long shadows across Oak Ridge Estates. The neighborhood was waking slowly, sprinklers ticking to life, dogs tugging at leashes, coffee brewing behind kitchen windows. It was a day like any other, yet beneath the ordinary hum, something subtle had shifted. The meeting from the night before had lingered in the minds of many, like a tune that would not stop playing. People moved through their routines with a faint awareness that decisions had been made, but consequences had yet to fully appear. For Eduardo, the day began long before the neighborhood stirred. He rose before dawn, as he always did, slipping quietly from bed and buttoning his worn jacket while the world was still dark. There were deliveries to organize, bags to pack, and stops he needed to make before the shelter opened. Despite the previous night's vote, despite the weight in his chest, he moved with practiced rhythm. Service was not something he offered only when circumstances were convenient. It was the shape of his life. The truck stood where it always did, its chipped paint catching the gentle morning light. Eduardo loaded it carefully, stacking food boxes, blankets, and medical supplies destined for families who never saw the inside of a neat HOA meeting room. As he worked, the neighborhood slowly came alive around him. Some residents waved like they always had. Some watched him with a new mix of discomfort and compassion after hearing his story. A few, unsure how to face him after siding with the board, retreated quickly indoors on the opposite end of the street. An unusual quiet filled the home of Ms. Porter, one of the board's firmest traditionalists. Her son, Daniel, had returned late the night before, unexpected, pale, and exhausted. He had come home early from deployment due to an injury he downplayed, but could not hide. His mother fussed over him with a fragile worry she tried to conceal, adjusting pillows, preparing meals, apologizing in gentle bursts for not knowing how to help. Daniel insisted he didn't need much. What he did need was a specific kind of medical equipment, supplies that were difficult to transport alone and too bulky for a regular car. He hadn't told his mother yet. He didn't want her to worry. He planned to arrange transportation himself that morning. He stepped outside carefully, leaning on the railing as sunlight washed across the street. That was when he noticed the yellow truck rumbling softly in the distance. His breath caught, not in recognition of the truck itself, but in recognition of the man stepping into it. Something about the posture, the profile, the slow, careful movement struck a familiar chord. For a long moment, he watched as the truck eased onto the road. The sound of its engine, the steady putter, the rhythmic knock he hadn't heard in years. pulled at an old memory so vivid it overwhelmed the present. It transported him back to sandy roads and field tents, to long shifts and brief respites during his first years of service. A particular mission, a particular man, a rescuer whose courage had been quiet but fierce, and suddenly, he remembered the truck from countless delivery routes meant to aid struggling families in old neighborhoods. He remembered the man who volunteered on holidays when many others wished to rest. But more vividly, he remembered a day when he himself had needed help, far from home, injured and stranded, waiting for transport that hadn't arrived. A man had driven by coincidence through the area assisting a humanitarian group, using a beat-up yellow truck shipped over for supply work. A man who lifted him from the ground, wrapped his wound, and carried him to safety. Daniel had never known the stranger's name. He remembered only the kindness, the calloused hands, the quiet endurance, the same quiet he now saw again. Eduardo Jimenez was the man who had saved his life that a tremor passed through Daniel, one his mother noticed immediately when she stepped outside. When she followed his gaze, she saw only the truck she had voted against the night before, an object she had considered an irritation, an eyesore in their perfect neighborhood. She had no idea how wrong she had been. The morning unfolded quickly after that moment of recognition. Word spread not through gossip, but through genuine urgency. A young mother whose child relied on weekly deliveries from Eduardo approached the clubhouse with a stack of handwritten letters from grateful families. A few neighbors from the far end of the street, who'd long kept quiet out of fear of the board's disapproval, arrived with their own testimonies. Stories layered upon stories, each of them unveiling what the truck meant, not to one person, but to the community beyond the HOA's polished boundaries. But nothing rippled through the neighborhood as powerfully as what happened next. That late morning, two large vans approached Oak Ridge Estates. Their appearance surprised everyone, especially the board members who happened to be outside discussing the logistics of enforcing the fines. The vans bore the logo of a well-known community outreach organization. Volunteers emerged carrying boxes, medical kits, and crates of food, each with Eduardo's name written on the manifest. They were here because Eduardo had given freely to their programs for years. They had heard about the upcoming fines from a neighbor who felt guilt and outrage after the meeting. The organization wanted to ensure that Eduardo's work did not stop because of a rule meant to cover cosmetic appearances rather than moral substance. Residents gathered around, some with gratitude, some with disbelief. The board watched, frozen in place, as one of the volunteers explained that Eduardo was one of their most reliable partners. His truck had delivered thousands of meals, hundreds of blankets, and countless supplies to families in need. He was known in surrounding districts. He was respected. He was, in every sense of the word, essential. But the moment that truly tipped the neighborhood's consciousness came when Daniel stepped forward. His mother followed, confused and anxious, unaware of the truth her son carried in front of neighbors, volunteers, and the stun board. Daniel steadied himself, lifted his voice, and shared who Eduardo truly was. Not just a volunteer, not just a helper, but a man who had once saved his life. A man whose presence in their neighborhood was not a burden, but a blessing. The crowd fell into profound silence. The board members felt something heavy and unfamiliar coil around their certainty. Shame, understanding, a shifting of perspective they had resisted for too long. Eduardo, who had been standing at the far edge of the gathering, looked down in humble discomfort. He had never spoken of his past actions, never shared the depth of his contributions. He had never believed kindness needed to be announced. As residents absorbed the truth, several stepped closer to him, some teary-eyed, some apologetic, some overwhelmed by the realization that they had voted against the very heart of their community. But the story was not over. The consequences of the vote still lingered. And now the board had to confront a reality that weighed far heavier than any rulebook. They had judged a man by the look of his truck, not the content of his character. The afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the gathering. The truth had been uncovered, but whether the board would reverse its decision and whether the community would correct its mistake still hung suspended in the air. The neighborhood settled into an unusual quiet after Daniel's revelation, a quiet thick with reflection. What had begun as a complaint about an old truck had transformed into something far larger, something that even the HOA could no longer ignore. People who once avoided acknowledging the truck now saw him differently. Lines that were once rigid had begun to blur, and the veneer of perfection Oak Ridge Estates clung to so tightly had cracked just enough for truth to seep through. That afternoon, the board members retreated to the clubhouse for an emergency session. Their steps were slower, measured, as though each one carried a weight they had not felt the night before. The president clutched her clipboard with less confidence than usual, the crisp pages suddenly feeling flimsy against the gravity of their mistake. Around the long table, faces that had once radiated certainty were replaced with conflicted expressions. They knew the vote had been made hastily, perhaps even carelessly, without understanding the full scope of Eduardo's role in the community. And now that ignorance appeared almost unforgivable, there was a long, uncomfortable silence before anyone spoke. They discussed the rulebook, the necessity of standards, and the importance of maintaining appearances. But those arguments no longer sounded strong. Not after hearing the stories, not after witnessing people's gratitude, not after seeing Daniel's emotional confession. For the first time, the board was forced to confront the difference between enforcing rules and upholding values. And the two did not always align. As the board debated, the neighborhood gathered outside the clubhouse. Families formed small circles, speaking softly. Children played near the old truck, running their hands over its warm metal, as if sensing it was part of something bigger than themselves. Elderly residents stood in thoughtful clusters, reminiscing about times when communities relied on people, not policies, to keep everyone connected. Even those who had voted for enforcement now felt the sting of regret, realizing their decision had come from assumptions made in haste. In the midst of this, Eduardo remained separate from the crowd. He sat at the edge of his porch, hands folded loosely, eyes cast toward the horizon. He had never sought recognition for his efforts. To him, kindness had always been a quiet responsibility, an act of service without the need for praise. Yet even he felt the neighborhood's shifting energy, like a tide turning gently but insistently. He wondered if the community he had lived in for so long could truly understand him now, or if their newfound admiration was temporary, fragile, built on emotion rather than genuine change. As the sun began to lower behind the roofs, the clubhouse doors opened. The board stepped outside, visibly transformed. The president cleared her throat as neighbors circled around, anticipation rippling through the group like an unspoken question. For a moment, the air held its breath. Then, with a tone far softer than the one that had carried through the meeting the night before, the president announced their decision. The board would reverse the vote. The rule would not apply to Eduardo's truck. Not because of pity, not because of pressure, but because they recognized that the rule did not honor the true spirit of community. They admitted they had made a mistake, acknowledged that appearances should never outweigh compassion, and vowed to reconsider how the neighborhood balanced order with humanity. The words were met with visible relief, a release of tension that had built quietly and forcefully over the past days. Some residents clapped softly. Others sighed, shoulders dropping as if a long-held breath finally escaped. A few wiped tears, surprised by their own emotions. Children cheered, unaware of the complexity but thrilled by the outcome. But the moment that struck deepest came when the president, usually stern and unmoved, approached Eduardo directly. She thanked him, not just for what he had done for the neighborhood, but for showing them what it meant to serve others without expectation. She admitted the board had forgotten the purpose of community, and that his actions had reminded them of the heart behind the rules they so strictly enforced. Eduardo accepted the apology with quiet humility. He did not need grand gestures. He did not need applause. The simple acknowledgement was enough. In the days that followed, the neighborhood changed, not outwardly, not in the manicured lawns or polished driveways, but in ways far more meaningful. Neighbors began offering help before waiting to be asked. They started noticing each other more, greeting each other with genuine warmth instead of polite habit. Families who had never spoken to one another shared stories on sidewalks. Older residents received unexpected visits from teens who offered to take out trash or mow lawns. The small acts of service that Eduardo had carried alone began to spread like gentle echoes of his example. The old truck, once seen as a blemish, became an emblem, not of disorder, but of purpose. It remained parked in its usual spot, unhidden and unbothered, its faded paint now a reminder that worth was never measured by appearance. Children waved whenever they saw it rumble down the street. Adults offered quiet nods, acknowledging the history the truck held. And the board, once rigid, softened into something more human. Even the president, who had long considered rules her armor, began to look at things differently. She walked the neighborhood more often, noticing not the imperfections, but the people. People whose stories she had never taken the time to understand. For the first time, her clipboard remained at home more days than not. For Daniel. His recovery continued slowly. With newfound appreciation, he visited Eduardo often, helping him sort supplies, lifting boxes, sharing stories from his service that he had never spoken aloud before. He found comfort in the company of the man who had once carried him to safety. And in turn, he offered his own strength where he could point one afternoon. As autumn inched closer and the leaves began to change, Eduardo stood beside his truck with a distant, peaceful gaze. The neighborhood around him felt somehow fuller, more connected, more real. He never sought recognition, but he felt something better, belonging. The old truck gleamed under the sunset, its worn edges catching the light just right. It was imperfect. It was weathered. It was irreplaceable. And for the first time, the neighborhood saw it exactly the way Eduardo did. Not as something that needed to be hidden, but as something that carried stories, carried hope, carried people when they needed it most. Karma had not come in thunder or spectacle. It had come quietly, gently, through truth and understanding. And in its wake, Oak Ridge Estates became a place where compassion mattered more than perfection, a place finally worthy of the people living in it. Eduardo started the engine, letting its familiar hum fill the air, and drove off toward his next delivery. Not because he had to, but because it was who he was. And now, at last, his community understood that.